Imagine this. You're asleep in your bed, it's 3 in the morning, and suddenly, you hear something. Not thunder, no, this is different. This is a sound like a freight train barreling through your bedroom wall, and when you open your eyes, your neighbor's house is gone, just vanished into the darkness. April 5th, 1936. 2 towns, separated by hundreds of miles, about to face nature's most violent fury. Tupelo, Mississippi. Gainesville, Georgia. Before the sun rose again, more than 400 people would be dead, thousands injured, and entire neighborhoods erased from existence. This is the story you've never heard in full, the tornado outbreak that time forgot. And tonight, we're going back to those 72 hours when the sky turned deadly. Stay with me, because what happened in the spring of 1936 will shock you, it will move you, and it will make you understand just how fragile the line between life and death truly is. Spring 1936. The American South was grinding through the Great Depression, families struggling, communities barely holding on. In Tupelo, Mississippi, a small town of about 7,000 souls, people went about their lives with quiet determination. Cotton mills, furniture factories, modest homes lining dirt roads. Nothing fancy, nothing grand, just ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary times. 300 miles to the east, Gainesville, Georgia, told a similar story. Factory workers, farmers, families making do with what little they had. The Cooper Pants factory downtown employed dozens, maybe hundreds of workers, stitching together garments, earning wages that kept food on the table. Nobody in either town could have known that a storm system forming hundreds of miles away was about to change everything. Now, let me take you into the science for just a moment, because understanding how this happened makes what comes next even more terrifying. Picture this: a massive low-pressure system, spinning counterclockwise, drawing warm, humid air up from the Gulf of Mexico, like a giant vacuum. That warm air, laden with moisture, collides with cooler, drier air from the north. Add to that mix powerful jet stream winds at high altitude, creating what meteorologists call wind shear, that twisting, turning force that can spawn the most violent tornadoes on Earth. All the ingredients were there: temperature, moisture, instability, shear. It was a recipe for disaster, and on April 5th, 1936, the oven was heating up. But here's the thing, and this is crucial: there were no warnings, no weather radar, no tornado sirens, no emergency broadcast systems. The National Weather Service wouldn't even begin issuing tornado warnings to the public for another 12 years. People in Tupelo and Gainesville had no idea what was coming. Think about that for a second. No warning. None. April 5th, evening. Families in Tupelo were settling in for the night. Children tucked into bed, parents finishing chores, the quiet rhythm of small-town life winding down. The sky had been overcast all day. A bit muggy, but nothing unusual for springtime in Mississippi. Maybe some distant thunder, a few flashes of lightning on the horizon, but nothing that screamed danger. In the Gum Pond neighborhood, on the north side of Tupelo, modest homes sat close together. Working-class families, black and white communities living side by side in an era of deep segregation, but united in their poverty, united in their struggle. These weren't mansions, these were simple wooden structures, some barely more than shacks, built with whatever materials people could afford. And that's important, because when an F5 tornado, the most violent category on the Fujita scale, with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, bears down on structures like that, there's simply no chance. Around 9:30 p.m. local time, maybe closer to 10, the storm system that had been churning across Arkansas and Louisiana began spawning tornadoes. Multiple funnels touched down across the region, tearing through farmland, ripping apart barns, uprooting trees. But these were just the opening act. The main event was still to come. Sometime around 2:55 a.m. on April 6th, in the dead of night when most of Tupelo slept, a massive funnel cloud descended from the sky just north of town. Witnesses who survived, and there weren't many in the direct path, described it as indescribable. The roar, they said, was like nothing they'd ever heard, like 1,000 trains, like the earth itself was being torn apart. The tornado, later rated F as 5, the highest possible rating, carved a path of total destruction through northern Tupelo, the Gum Pond area, the Willis Heights neighborhood, obliterated. Entire city blocks, 48 of them, reduced to splinters and rubble in a matter of minutes. Homes didn't just collapse, they exploded. Walls blown outward, roofs launched hundreds of feet into the air, furniture, belongings, people, sucked up into the vortex and scattered across the countryside. Pine trees, thick and sturdy, were snapped like toothpicks, and in one of the most haunting details, pine needles were found embedded deep into the trunks of trees that remained standing, driven in by winds so powerful they turned organic matter into projectiles. And then, silence. The kind of silence that follows unspeakable horror. When the sun began to rise over Tupelo on the morning of April 6th, the scope of the devastation became clear, and it was beyond comprehension. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Not damaged, not destroyed, gone. Foundations swept clean, nothing left but bare earth and scattered debris. The Gum Pond area, where dozens of families had lived just hours before, was now a wasteland. And in the center of that wasteland, a pond, and floating in that pond, bodies. Men, women, children, their lives snuffed out in an instant, now floating in the water like discarded dolls. The death toll in Tupelo alone would eventually reach 216 confirmed dead, though many believe the true number was higher. Hundreds more were injured, some critically, and the town's small hospital was overwhelmed. Makeshift medical stations were set up in churches, in the courthouse, even in the local movie theater. Doctors and nurses worked through the day and into the night, amputating limbs, stitching wounds, trying desperately to save lives. One of the families that survived, barely, lived in a small shotgun house in East Tupelo. The father, Vernon Presley, a laborer, his wife Gladys, and their infant son, a baby boy born just a year earlier, in January of 1935. The tornado passed close, terrifyingly close, but their home held. That baby boy would grow up to become one of the most famous people in the world, Elvis Presley. Years later, Elvis would say he had no memory of that night. He was too young. But his mother told him the story many times. How the wind howled, how the house shook, how they huddled together in the darkness praying, how, when morning came, they walked outside and saw nothing. Their neighbors' homes, gone, friends, family, dead. It's one of those strange twists of history, isn't it? That one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century survived one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history. By sheer luck. But the storm wasn't finished, not even close. As the sun rose over the ruins of Tupelo, that same storm system, that same supercell, was racing eastward at over 50 miles per hour, tearing through Alabama, spawning more tornadoes, leaving more destruction in its wake. And its next target, Gainesville, Georgia. April 6th, early morning. While Tupelo was still reeling, still counting its dead, still digging through rubble, the people of Gainesville were waking up, getting ready for work, starting what they thought would be just another Monday. Factory workers headed to the Cooper Pants factory downtown. Farmers tended their fields. Children got ready for school. The sky was overcast, a bit ominous maybe. But again, no warnings. No one in Gainesville had any idea that a killer tornado had just ripped through Mississippi hours earlier, and no one knew that the same storm system was now bearing down on them. Around 8:30 in the morning, maybe a bit earlier, the sky over Gainesville began to darken. Not the gradual darkening of a typical storm, but a sudden, unnatural darkness, like someone had thrown a blanket over the sun. The air grew still, oppressively still, and then the wind began to pick up. What happened next is almost too horrific to describe, but we have to, because this is history, and history demands to be told. 2 tornadoes, 2 separate funnels, touched down near Gainesville almost simultaneously. They moved through the countryside, tearing through farms and forests, and then they merged. Two tornadoes became one, a massive churning monster of wind and debris, and it headed straight for downtown Gainesville. Grove Street, the heart of the city, was hit first. Brick buildings, some of them 3 and 4 stories tall, collapsed. Not damaged, collapsed. Walls fell inward, roofs caved in, and within seconds, downtown Gainesville was buried under 10 feet of rubble. 10 feet. Imagine that. Imagine a pile of bricks and wood and glass and metal, 10 feet high, stretching for blocks. But the worst, the absolute worst, was yet to come. The Cooper Pants factory, a large brick building on the south side of town, was full of workers that morning. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 70 and 100 people were inside. Mostly women, sitting at sewing machines, stitching fabric, earning their wages. When the tornado hit, the building didn't stand a chance. The walls collapsed inward, the roof came down, and in the chaos, in the dust and the screaming and the terror, a fire broke out. Maybe from a boiler, maybe from electrical wires sparking, no one knows for sure, but within minutes, the factory was burning. And here's the nightmare. The main stairwell, the primary escape route, was blocked. Blocked by debris, blocked by flames, and the people trapped inside. They couldn't get out. They couldn't get out. Survivors outside could hear them, could hear the screaming, the pounding on walls, the desperate cries for help, and there was nothing they could do. The fire was too intense, the rubble too heavy, and one by one, the voices fell silent. When rescuers finally managed to dig through the wreckage hours later, they found at least 70 bodies inside the factory. Some had been crushed by falling debris, others had burned to death, and some had suffocated in the smoke. It remains to this day the deadliest tornado-related death toll at a single building in United States history. Let that sink in for a moment. 70 people, trapped, burning, dying, while others stood outside, helpless. The final death toll in Gainesville was 203, with more than 1,600 injured. Combined with Tupelo and the other tornadoes in the outbreak, the total death toll exceeded 450 people, making it the second deadliest tornado outbreak in American history, surpassed only by the tri-state tornado of 1925. But here's what makes this outbreak so unique, so historically significant. It produced 2 tornadoes in 2 different states, each killing more than 200 people. That had never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. 2 towns separated by hundreds of miles, connected by tragedy. In the days that followed, the nation reacted with shock and grief. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, just 3 years into his presidency and still navigating the Great Depression, immediately mobilized federal aid. On April 9th, just 3 days after the Gainesville tornado, Roosevelt traveled by train to Georgia to survey the damage himself. He walked through the ruins, spoke with survivors, promised assistance, and his visit brought national attention to the disaster. Federal relief funds flowed in, the Red Cross set up operations, and slowly, painfully, the work of rebuilding began. But rebuilding wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about lives. Families had been shattered, children orphaned, entire communities traumatized. In Tupelo, mass funerals were held, dozens of caskets lined up in rows, and the grief was overwhelming. In Gainesville, the scene was similar. The town cemetery filled with fresh graves, and the question on everyone's mind was, why? Why did this happen? Why were there no warnings? Why did so many have to die? The question of why haunted survivors for years, decades even. Why were there no warnings? Why did the storm strike with such ferocity, and perhaps most painfully? Why did they survive when so many others didn't? To understand the answer, we need to step back and look at the state of meteorology in 1936, because the truth is, the science simply wasn't there yet. Weather forecasting was primitive by today's standards, incredibly primitive. There was no Doppler radar, no satellite imagery, no computer models predicting storm tracks days in advance. Meteorologists relied on surface observations, barometric pressure readings, and reports from weather stations scattered across the country, often hundreds of miles apart. And here's the critical part. Even if meteorologists had been able to predict the tornadoes, there was no system in place to warn the public. The United States Weather Bureau, the predecessor to today's National Weather Service, actually had a policy against issuing tornado warnings. That's right, a policy against it. Why? Because officials feared that warning the public about tornadoes would cause mass panic, would be seen as crying wolf when tornadoes didn't materialize, and would ultimately do more harm than good. Think about the tragic irony of that. The very institution responsible for public safety actively refused to warn people about one of nature's deadliest phenomena. It wasn't until 1948, 12 years after Tupelo and Gainesville, that the Weather Bureau finally began issuing tornado warnings. And even then, they were limited and often ineffective. So the people of Tupelo went to bed that night with no warning. The workers at the Cooper Pants factory showed up that morning with no warning. They were sitting ducks, and they never even knew the gun was pointed at them. Let's talk about the survivors for a moment, because their stories are what make this real, what transforms statistics into human tragedy. In Tupelo, a woman named Maddie Mitchell was sleeping in her home in the Gum Pond area when the tornado hit. She later described waking up to a sound like, and I'm quoting here, like the world was being torn in half. She grabbed her 2 young children, tried to run, but before she could even reach the door, the walls of her house exploded outward. She remembered being lifted, flying through the air, tumbling, and then nothing. Darkness. When she regained consciousness, she was lying in a field, maybe 200 yards from where her house had stood. Her children were gone. Just gone. She screamed their names, crawled through the mud and debris, searching, and finally, she found them. Her daughter, alive, trapped under a fallen tree but breathing. Her son didn't make it. He was 5 years old. Maddie Mitchell survived, but a part of her died that night, and in interviews decades later, you could still hear the pain in her voice, still see the haunted look in her eyes. She never fully recovered. How could she? How could anyone? In Gainesville, a man named Robert Bell was working at a hardware store downtown when the tornado struck. He heard the roar, looked out the window, and saw, and this is how he described it, a black wall spinning, coming right at us. He dove under a counter, covered his head, and then the building came down. He was buried under bricks and timber, trapped in a pocket of space barely large enough to breathe in, and he stayed there for 4 hours before rescuers dug him out. 4 hours in total darkness, not knowing if he would live or die, listening to the muffled sounds of people screaming, of fire crackling, of the world above him in chaos. When they finally pulled him out, his legs were crushed, and doctors had to amputate one of them. But he considered himself lucky because he was alive, and so many others weren't. These stories, and there are hundreds of them, thousands maybe, paint a picture of unimaginable horror and remarkable resilience. People who lost everything, who watched loved ones die, who suffered injuries that would haunt them for life. And yet, they carried on. They rebuilt. They persevered. They survived. Now, let's dive deeper into the meteorology, because understanding the science helps us appreciate just how rare and how powerful this outbreak truly was. The storm system that spawned the Tupelo and Gainesville tornadoes was what meteorologists call a supercell, a rotating thunderstorm with a deep, persistent updraft. Supercells are the rarest type of thunderstorm, accounting for less than 1% of all thunderstorms. But they're responsible for nearly all of the strongest tornadoes, the EF4s and EF5s that cause catastrophic damage. On April 5, 1936, conditions across the southeast were perfect for supercell development. A strong low-pressure system was moving northeast from Texas, drawing warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico northward. At the same time, a cold front was pushing south from Canada, and where these two air masses collided, instability, massive instability. The atmosphere was loaded with what meteorologists call CAPE, convective available potential energy, essentially the fuel that powers thunderstorms. High CAPE values mean the atmosphere is primed for explosive storm development, and on April 5th, CAPE values across Mississippi and Alabama were off the charts. Add to that strong wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, and you have the perfect recipe for rotating storms. The jet stream, a river of fast-moving air at high altitude, was positioned just right, providing the upper-level support needed to sustain these storms for hours. As the supercell moved across Mississippi in the early morning hours of April 6th, it began producing tornadoes. The first few were relatively weak, EF1s and EF2s, causing damage but not catastrophic destruction. But as the storm intensified, as it fed on the warm, moist air streaming in from the Gulf, it spawned the monster that would hit Tupelo, an EF5, with winds estimated at over 260 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, at 260 miles per hour, wind pressure is so intense that it can literally peel asphalt off roads, can drive pieces of straw through wooden boards, can turn ordinary objects into deadly missiles. A 2x4 piece of lumber, traveling at that speed, becomes a spear capable of piercing concrete. A pebble becomes a bullet. The Tupelo tornado was on the ground for over 30 miles, carving a path of destruction up to a mile wide in some places. That's an enormous tornado, both in terms of size and longevity, and the fact that it struck a populated area in the middle of the night made it exponentially more deadly. After devastating Tupelo, the supercell continued eastward, moving across Alabama and into Georgia. It spawned several more tornadoes along the way, smaller ones mostly, but the storm was far from finished. As it approached Gainesville in the early morning hours of April 6th, conditions were still favorable for tornado development, and the storm obliged. What happened in Gainesville was, in some ways, even more meteorologically fascinating than Tupelo because of the double tornado phenomenon. Two separate tornadoes, spawned from the same supercell, touched down almost simultaneously just west of the city. They moved on parallel paths, maybe a mile or two apart. And then, they merged. This is called a satellite tornado merger, and it's incredibly rare. When two tornadoes merge, the resulting tornado is often more powerful than either of the original two, because the rotational energy combines. In Gainesville's case, the merged tornado became a monster, an EF4, with winds estimated at over 200 miles per hour, and it plowed directly through downtown. The timing was also significant. Unlike Tupelo, where the tornado struck in the dead of night when most people were home asleep, the Gainesville tornado hit around 8:30 in the morning, right when people were starting their workday. Factories were full, stores were opening, streets were busy. More people were exposed, more people were in vulnerable locations, and the death toll reflected that. The Cooper Pants factory, as we discussed, was the single deadliest location, but it wasn't the only building destroyed. The entire downtown area, blocks and blocks of brick buildings, was reduced to rubble. The Gainesville courthouse, a landmark structure, was heavily damaged. Churches, schools, homes, all gone. And then there was the fire. In the chaos following the tornado, multiple fires broke out across the city, fueled by broken gas lines, overturned stoves, and electrical sparks. With water mains ruptured and fire equipment buried under debris, firefighters were helpless to stop the flames from spreading. The Cooper Pants factory fire was the most deadly, but it was far from the only one. By the time the fires were finally extinguished, hours later, entire city blocks had burned to the ground. Gainesville, a thriving town of over 10,000 people, looked like a war zone. In the immediate aftermath, the response was chaotic but heroic. Survivors dug through rubble with their bare hands, pulling out the injured, searching for the missing. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, performing surgeries in makeshift operating rooms, often without anesthesia or proper equipment. The Red Cross arrived within hours, setting up shelters and distributing food, water, and medical supplies. But the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. In Tupelo, with over 200 dead and hundreds more injured, the town's small hospital simply couldn't cope. Patients were laid out in hallways, on floors, anywhere there was space. Supplies ran out quickly, and doctors had to make impossible decisions about who to treat first, who might survive, and who was beyond help. In Gainesville, the situation was even worse. With downtown destroyed and fires still burning, there was nowhere to take the injured. Makeshift hospitals were set up in schools, in churches, even in private homes. Trains were used as ambulances, transporting the most critically injured to hospitals in Atlanta over 50 miles away. The death toll continued to rise as more bodies were recovered from the rubble. In Tupelo, the final count reached 216, though many historians believe the true number was higher, as some victims were never found, their bodies scattered across the countryside or buried under debris that was never fully excavated. In Gainesville, the official death toll was 203, but again, the true number may have been higher. The Cooper Pants factory alone accounted for at least 70 deaths, and some estimates put the number closer to 100. Combined with the other tornadoes in the outbreak, which struck communities across Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, the total death toll exceeded 450, with over 2,500 injured. It was and remains the second deadliest tornado outbreak in United States history. President Roosevelt's visit to Gainesville on April 9th was a turning point, not just for the town, but for the nation's approach to disaster relief. Roosevelt, who had championed the New Deal and expanded the federal government's role in addressing the Great Depression, saw the tornado devastation as another opportunity to demonstrate federal leadership. He arrived by train, accompanied by a delegation of officials and journalists, and spent several hours touring the ruins. Photographs from that day show Roosevelt. Seated in his wheelchair, he had been paralyzed by polio years earlier, surrounded by survivors, listening to their stories, offering words of comfort and promises of aid, and he delivered on those promises. Within days, federal relief funds began flowing into Tupelo and Gainesville. The Works Progress Administration, one of Roosevelt's New Deal programs, sent workers to help with cleanup and rebuilding. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation provided low-interest loans to businesses and homeowners. The Red Cross, with federal support, established long-term relief operations in both towns. But money and manpower, while necessary, couldn't heal the psychological wounds. Survivors struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1936 there was no name for it, no treatment, no understanding. People simply suffered in silence, haunted by nightmares, by survivors' guilt, by the memories of that terrible day. Children who lived through the tornadoes carried the trauma into adulthood. Many developed phobias of storms, of wind, of darkness. Some refused to live in houses, preferring to sleep outside, where they could see the sky, where they wouldn't be trapped if another tornado struck. Others left the region entirely, unable to bear the constant reminders of what they'd lost. The rebuilding process was slow and painful. In Tupelo, entire neighborhoods had to be reconstructed from scratch. The Gum Pond area, which had been predominantly black and poor, was rebuilt, but many families never returned. Some had lost everything and couldn't afford to rebuild. Others simply couldn't face living in the place where they'd lost loved ones. The town did make some improvements in the wake of the disaster. Building codes were strengthened, though not by much, and there was a push to construct more storm shelters, though funding was limited. The hospital was expanded and better equipped, and emergency response protocols were developed, rudimentary by today's standards, but better than nothing. In Gainesville, the rebuilding was even more extensive. The entire downtown area had to be reconstructed, and city leaders saw it as an opportunity to modernize. Wider streets were laid out, new brick buildings with stronger foundations were erected, and fire safety became a priority. The Cooper Pants factory was never rebuilt. The site remained vacant for years, a haunting reminder of the tragedy. But Gainesville also built something else, a memorial. In the years following the tornado, survivors and community leaders pushed for a permanent monument to honor the dead and commemorate the disaster. In 1937, just 1 year after the tornado, a memorial was dedicated in the town square, a simple stone marker with the names of the victims etched into it. That memorial still stands today, and every year on April 6th, survivors and their descendants gather there to remember, to honor the dead, and to reflect on the fragility of life. Now, let's talk about the broader impact of the Tupelo Gainesville outbreak, because this disaster didn't just affect two towns. It changed the way America thought about tornadoes and disaster preparedness. Before 1936, tornadoes were seen as acts of God, unpredictable and unavoidable. There was a fatalistic attitude. If a tornado was going to hit, It was going to hit, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. But the sheer scale of the Tupelo Gainesville disaster, the fact that over 400 people died in a single outbreak, forced people to reconsider that attitude. Scientists and meteorologists began pushing for better tornado research, for improved forecasting methods, for a system to warn the public. But progress was slow, agonizingly slow. The Weather Bureau remained resistant to issuing tornado warnings, and it wasn't until 1948, after another deadly tornado struck Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, that the military demanded better forecasting. 2 Air Force officers, Major Ernest Fawbush and Captain Robert Miller, developed the first successful tornado forecasting method, and on March 25, 1948, they issued the first official tornado forecast in history. It was a success. The tornado struck exactly where and when they predicted, and suddenly, tornado forecasting became a priority. By the early 1950s, the Weather Bureau began issuing public tornado warnings, and over the following decades, the system improved dramatically. Doppler radar was developed in the 1970s, allowing meteorologists to see inside storms and detect rotation. Satellite technology provided a bird's-eye view of weather systems. Computer models became more sophisticated, able to predict storm development hours or even days in advance. Today, the average lead time for a tornado warning is about 13 minutes, and while that might not sound like much, it's enough to save lives. People can take shelter, can move to interior rooms or basements, can get out of vulnerable buildings. The death toll from tornadoes has dropped dramatically since the 1930s, not because tornadoes are less frequent or less powerful, but because we can see them coming. And that progress, that life-saving technology, can be traced back, in part, to the lessons learned from Tupelo and Gainesville. But there's another legacy of the 1936 outbreak, one that's less tangible but equally important: the resilience of the human spirit. In the face of unimaginable tragedy, the people of Tupelo and Gainesville didn't give up. They didn't abandon their towns, didn't surrender to despair. They buried their dead, they mourned their losses, and then they rebuilt. They came together as communities, supported each other, and slowly, painfully, they moved forward. There are stories of incredible generosity and compassion. Neighbors who had lost everything themselves still helped others. Strangers who traveled from distant towns to volunteer, to donate, to offer whatever assistance they could. Churches that opened their doors to anyone in need, regardless of race or religion, in an era when segregation was the law of the land. One story that stands out involves a man named John Stevens, a farmer from outside Tupelo who wasn't directly affected by the tornado. When he heard about the disaster, he loaded his truck with food from his farm, vegetables, chickens, whatever he could spare, and drove into town. He spent the next week distributing food to survivors, asking for nothing in return, and when his supplies ran out, he went back to his farm, loaded up again, and returned. He wasn't the only one. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people did similar things. Small acts of kindness that, collectively, made an enormous difference. And that spirit of community, of mutual support, helped Tupelo and Gainesville not just survive, but thrive in the years that followed. Let's also consider the statistical and historical significance of this outbreak, because the numbers are staggering. The Tupelo Gainesville outbreak produced at least 14 confirmed tornadoes over a roughly 24-hour period. 2 of those tornadoes, the Tupelo tornado and the Gainesville tornado, were rated F5 and F4, respectively, the highest categories on the Fujita scale. The combined path length of all the tornadoes exceeded 300 miles, and the total area of destruction was measured in square miles. But what makes this outbreak truly unique in the annals of tornado history is that it produced 2 tornadoes in 2 different states, each killing more than 200 people. That had never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. The Tri-State Tornado of 1925, which remains the deadliest single tornado in U.S. history, killed 695 people. But it was one tornado. The Tupelo Gainesville outbreak was a series of tornadoes, a sustained assault by nature that lasted an entire day and night. To put this in perspective, Let's compare it to other major tornado outbreaks in American history. The super outbreak of April 1974, which many consider the most intense tornado outbreak ever recorded, produced 148 tornadoes over a 16-state area and killed 330 people. That's fewer deaths than Tupelo Gainesville, despite producing 10 times as many tornadoes. Why? Because by 1974, we had warning systems, we had radar, we had emergency protocols. People knew tornadoes were coming and could take shelter. In 1936, they had none of that. The Joplin, Missouri tornado of 2011, one of the deadliest tornadoes in recent history, killed 161 people despite being an EF5 that struck a city of 50,000. Again, warning systems saved lives. People had time to take shelter, and while the death toll was still tragic, it could have been so much worse. Tupelo and Gainesville didn't have that luxury, and the death toll reflected it. There's also the racial dimension of the disaster that we need to address, because it's an important part of the story, even if it's uncomfortable. In 1936, the South was deeply segregated. Jim Crow laws enforced racial separation in schools, hospitals, public transportation, even cemeteries. Black Americans were second-class citizens, denied basic rights, subjected to discrimination and violence. When the tornadoes struck, they didn't discriminate. The wind didn't care about the color of your skin, didn't care about your social status or your wealth. It destroyed black homes and white homes with equal ferocity, killed black families and white families without distinction. But in the aftermath, segregation reared its ugly head. In Tupelo, black survivors were often given lower priority for medical treatment, were housed in separate inferior shelters, and received less assistance from relief organizations. The Gum Pond area, which was predominantly black, was slower to receive aid and slower to rebuild. In Gainesville, the situation was similar. Black victims were buried in segregated sections of the cemetery, and black families received less compensation and fewer resources for rebuilding. The Cooper Pants Factory, where so many died, employed both black and white workers, but the black workers were paid less and worked in the most dangerous sections of the building. These injustices didn't go unnoticed. Black newspapers of the era, publications like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, reported on the disparities and called for equal treatment. Some black leaders used the disaster to highlight the broader injustices of segregation, arguing that if black and white Americans could die together in a tornado, they should be able to live together in equality. It would be decades before the civil rights movement achieved meaningful change, but the Tupelo Gainesville disaster was one of many events that planted the seeds of that movement. As the years passed, as the immediate crisis faded and life returned to something resembling normal, the memory of the tornadoes began to fade as well. Survivors aged, passed away, and younger generations grew up hearing stories, but not fully understanding the magnitude of what had happened. By the 1960s and 70s, the Tupelo Gainesville outbreak was largely forgotten outside of the local communities. History books mentioned it in passing, if at all, and it was overshadowed by other disasters, other tragedies, other events that captured the nation's attention. But in Tupelo and Gainesville, the memory endured. Survivors formed groups, held annual commemorations, and worked to preserve the history of the disaster. In Tupelo, the Elvis Presley connection helped keep the story alive, as tourists visiting Graceland and the Elvis birthplace learned about the tornado that nearly killed the future king of rock and roll. In Gainesville, the memorial in the town square became a focal point for remembrance, and in later years, additional markers were placed at the site of the Cooper Pants Factory and other significant locations. In 2006, on the 70th anniversary of the disaster, both towns held major commemorative events. Survivors, now in their 80s and 90s, shared their stories with younger generations. Historians gave presentations, documentaries were produced, and for a brief moment, the nation remembered. But even today, if you ask the average American about the deadliest tornado outbreaks in history, most will mention the tri-state tornado, or maybe the super outbreak of 1974. Few will mention Tupelo Gainesville, and that's a shame, because this disaster deserves to be remembered, not just for the lives lost, but for the lessons learned and the resilience demonstrated. So, what are those lessons? What can we take away from the Tupelo Gainesville outbreak nearly 90 years after it happened? First, and most obviously, the importance of warning systems. The fact that over 400 people died without any warning is unconscionable by today's standards, and it's a stark reminder of how far we've come. Modern tornado warning systems, while not perfect, save thousands of lives every year, and we must continue to invest in and improve those systems. Second, the importance of building codes and infrastructure. Many of the deaths in Tupelo and Gainesville occurred because buildings simply couldn't withstand the force of the tornadoes. Today we have much stronger building codes, especially in tornado-prone areas, and we have safe rooms and storm shelters designed to protect people even in the most violent tornadoes. But there's still work to be done, especially in poorer communities where people can't afford to retrofit their homes or build shelters. Third, the importance of community and resilience. The people of Tupelo and Gainesville didn't just survive, they rebuilt, and they did it together. In times of crisis, communities come together, and that spirit of mutual support is something we need to nurture and preserve. And finally, the importance of remembering. History isn't just about dates and numbers. It's about people, about lives lived and lost, about struggles and triumphs. The Tupelo Gainesville outbreak is a part of American history, a part of our history, and we owe it to the victims and survivors to remember their stories, to honor their memory, and to learn from their experience.